On va pouvoir commencer.
We can get started. Good morning, everyone. We are delighted to see so many of you here this morning. My name is Juliette Benet, and I work for Plan International France, which is an NGO, and we're part of the Plan International network, working in more than 75 countries to make sure that the rights of youth and children are promoted, and also equality between boys and girls. We're delighted to be able to organize this session with the different teams from the Forum 3.0 and Convergence. So we're going to be talking about young and committed, you are legitimate, and how can we fight inequalities together. I also am delighted to be co-facilitating this with Favor from Plan des Jeunes, and I will let her introduce herself, and then we'll talk about how we're going to be organizing this morning. Thank you very much, Juliette. Good morning. I hope that you're doing well this morning. My name is Raquel Favor. I'm 23 years old. I am a student at the University of the Sorbonne Paris Nord. I'm in the second year of my master's. As Juliette mentioned, I'm also part of the Plan des Jeunes movement. What is the movement? This is a movement for youth working around questions linked to equality between girls and boys, but also rights of the child. And we have lots of different actions. For example, we look at raising awareness. We also look at youth, but also advocacy work for authorities, governments, and so on and so forth. And just to talk a little bit about the event today, we will have a very special format. We're going to have a fish boat. And what does this mean? This means that not only will the speakers and myself and Juliette be partaking in the event, but we're also hoping that you will be participating actively as well. Please don't hesitate to come up onto the stage with us. You can have the microphone, you can ask any questions that you may have, and you also can share any comments with us. You'll also be able to sit down, and if you want to share anything, you can do so. Please also feel free to interact on Twitter. With Plan des Jeunes, Plan France, you can use the hashtag Forum 3.0. I also would like to thank the different panelists that we have. We have 4 different speakers with us this morning, and I'm going to introduce you very briefly prior to getting into the heart of the matter. We've got Ikma Djoumoin. You were the head of the Solidarité Internationale MEGCL, and you were also co-founder of Actici in 2020. You are the co-designer of the Amba Sector, which is a program looking at youth from the Lyon region, different workshops looking at international solidarity, raising awareness, reflection, and citizenship. And you're also here as an elected member. You are a deputy for the E&D network, and you also represent your Actici network. Good morning, Ikma. Let's move on to Thibaut Espagnol now. You have a lot of experience under your belt, so not only on a national but also local level. You're part of the Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs, and this in Romania, Hungary, and Brazil. And you are currently the deputy delegate for civil society. Good morning. Lorraine Bastide, you are a journalist and you also are a feminist for gender parity in the media. You are a radio presenter as well in 2016. You co-founded Nouvelles Écoutes, and you're also the co-creator of a feminist podcast, Écoute. And for those who don't know this podcast, there are different interviews with women and women celebrities, and you also wrote an essay on the place of women in public spaces, especially in cities, policies, and politics and media. And last but not least, we go to Valérie Berquet, who is a sociologist. You're a professor at the Universities for Science of Education and Training at Cergy-Pontoise Université, and you're also a member of the laboratory École Mutation Apprentissage, school, working and learning. You also look at policies linked to education and the youth from a citizenship point of view, and also the different practices linked to youth engagement. Maybe to get the ball rolling this morning, I can ask the following question. What does youth commitment mean to you? Or even just commitment. What does commitment mean to you from a personal note? Maybe we can start with Ikma. What does commitment mean for me? To start off with, just the fact that you're defending a cause, regardless of what cause that may be, but something that's important to you, that for me is commitment. Be we talking about exchange in private spaces or in our professional life, from the moment that you are defending a cause to your dying breath, it's commitment. If we think about youth commitment now, we have lots of different types of youth. We have youth coming from all different horizons, with a lot of experience. Each type of commitment is unique to the type of youth engaging or committing. So for me, that's what commitment is. It's about defending a cause, regardless of the type of defense you want, in an organized fashion, on a personal fashion, but you're standing up for something you believe in. Thank you very much, Ikema. So here we're talking about lots of different type of youth. Youth have different faces. We're not just talking about youth in singular fashion, but plural rather. We've got international youth, we've got different backgrounds, different contexts, but we'll come back to the idea of youth on a plural. What about Lauren Bastide? I'm not young. I think that there is a generational gap between my generation and the 1990s, who maybe grew in an idealized world. Everything was very smooth in the media, and my commitment as a feminist came to be very late. I already had a very accomplished career, a family, and I feel that there's a huge difference, especially when we think about the feminist issue, between the young women who are 20 years old, even 14, 15 years old, who are very aware of these questions. They are conscious of the disparities that exist between the genders. They are very well read. They have figures, they have statistics, they have different literature to support their arguments, and this is very enthusiastic, not only for the Me Too movement, but also other causes that I defend. Therefore, I believe that the young generation, they could actually be my daughters, some of them, I believe that they're a lot more aware of what's going on. And when it comes to the notion of commitment, I think that when we think about commitment, we tend to think that it's associative or a part of a union or part of a political group. But I actually think that you can be committed regardless of the area that you may be, regardless of your profession, even if you don't work, even if you are a stay-at-home mother. There are lots of different ways that you can commit. I know that in different meetings there are women who say, I don't know how to commit. What can I do? Are there associations? Are there organizations? But actually, when you dig a little deeper, you realize that the woman's a nurse, and in the hospital, they've created a program for sexual health, or that she's a stay-at-home mother and she reads books against racism to her children, or she's a school teacher and she's put into place a program to raise awareness. I think that these types of commitments are also just as important as the more visible ones, because it's about fastening or shaping society from its very foundations. I know that lots of people find themselves in very sticky situations. I remember that women spent maybe 6 months fighting with their with their bosses because they wanted to sign their emails off as a female engineer in French and not the male version. And they're saying that's going to receive this email with engineer, but the feminine form in French, is going to know that this word exists and that I'm a woman. Therefore, there are lots of different ways to commit. Thank you very much, Lorraine. We will come back to this, but there are lots of different types of commitment and mobilization, be we talking youth or the not so young, and especially the specific aspect as well that you mentioned for girls and young ladies, young women. We will come back to this later in the conversation. Thibault l'Espagnol, maybe you want to jump in? What does youth commitment mean? I was going to say that I can't actually say any better what has already been said, but the approach that we have at the Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs, we have a very limited approach because we are more looking at youth commitment on an international basis in favor of international solidarity in development policy. But I would like to bounce off what Laurent said in the different types of commitment. We are seeing a change because we used to have a lot of associative commitment, which means that we find a lot of retirees who are part of organizations or structured associations, but now we're seeing a lot more individual commitment. We have alternatives, we have entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, and we're trying to think with the different associations about how we're able to adapt. And this is one of the working topics for a working group that we have created for the National Council for International Aid and Solidarity, the CMDC. In France, there is a very formal dialogue between the different ministries, but also actors of civil society to talk about youth development. And they will meet together on the 14th of September under the presidency of Michel for the international plan. This will allow us to look at the new types of commitment that are creeping out of the woodworks with young people, and also put into place the different steps so the ministry can support them. Thank you very much. Valérie Becquet, maybe you'd like to jump in here just to wrap up this first question. Shall I just summarize everything that's been said? Why not? You can. Maybe you have a couple of elements. Just to answer the first question, so my own commitment, I started working on youth commitment with different agreements with the way in how we spoke about youth commitment. There was a mismatch. I thought there was a lag, and I actually have been looking at this for the past 20 years, and I still believe that there is a mismatch between actual youth commitment and what we speak about. Yes, you're completely right. For feminism, there has been progress made, but when we think about how we apprehend or qualify or disqualify youth commitment, we're also trying to structure it, or we even not understand it. I believe that there is still a lot left to be done, and this type of roundtable is very important. As it currently stands, we insist on the types of youth engagement, and we're trying to avoid having a normative approach, what they should be, what we expect them to do, because this is how we create exclusion, or we can almost push the youth to stop their commitment. It is a real challenge to do this. And then we can also say that commitment is when so if we look at the etymology, it's something that makes sense. And we also think about a daily basis, how you can commit in public spaces, in your professional sphere, and there are different levels of intensity and also variables. The difficulty here is to have a certain discourse about engagement, commitment of youth and all different types of youth groups without getting rid of the different thickness that we have of the different practices, the different components of the social practice. Thank you very much. Yes, and when it comes to standards or norms as well, we will come back to this when we think about the risks that can be put on youth, especially when we think about the commitment. And now that you have an idea of what youth commitment is for our speakers, the next question is going to be, why do you think that youth commit, and what are the different positive aspects? I'm going to start with you, Ikma, once again, because you are a young, committed individual, and you also help different youth in their commitment. And I would like to know why you took this decision to commit, and why do you think that the youth that you're working with also have taken this decision to commit? I'd like to tell you a story. I am from Mayotte, which is an overseas department, and I started 10 kilometers away, or I had to leave my island, rather, I had to move 10,000 kilometers to study. I was far away from my home, and for me, this was a starting point for my commitment. It was my isolation, if you will. It was a complete culture shock. I needed to find my feet. I was in Lyon, so a huge city compared to Mayotte. It was a bit of a shock when I first got there. The first option is maybe to completely shut yourself up because you're scared. But then afterwards I thought, okay, what can I do? I started looking around myself, what are the different associations, the organizations that were around. I found the MEGCL, or JCL rather, which was an organization for those coming from the Comoros Islands. And this was an organization that saw the light of day in the Comoros Islands, and that was my starting point. In the framework of this commitment, a little while afterwards, because when I arrived, I said, okay, I'm not going to try and stand out for the crowd. I'm going to try and work to my scale and on my level, but I didn't think that I was going to be capable or in a position to have a real impact. But actually, a couple of months later, I became the president of the association because I had a lot of projects in mind. There were lots of things that I wanted to implement for students that were coming to the metropolis and that were far from their homes. I wanted to offer them a pathway allowing them to better integrate and also be part of the social life, because we got to Lyon and we were students, and I thought that it was quite regrettable that because we didn't understand what was going on in society in Lyon, that we weren't able to be part of that. Therefore, I was in the framework of this association. I came across a couple of problems as a person who was racialized, a woman. It was very complicated for me to have my voice heard. There's also the question of credibility, the question of, can I fight against the different prejudice? How do I show that I am capable and well equipped? And what can I do to ensure that I'm well equipped to conduct my different projects? How can I defend my cause? How can I ensure that I'm giving my utmost for the beneficiaries? Therefore, we tried to have a certain mentality, I would say. And I was able to acquire this thanks to E&D, engagé et déterminé, committed and determined. I was elected as a member of their board, and for me it was really eye-opening. It opened the door to Alibaba's cave. I had access to lots of different training. I had access to lots of support as well. From a professional point of view, we were able to render the process a lot more professional. We were working on inclusivity, issues linked to equality, openness to the world through education on citizenship and international solidarity. There was a lot of information given with regards to this, and at a certain moment in time I felt quite limited in this. And with my colleagues from this organization, we decided to create our own organization, which is Act Ici, Act Here, because we wanted to show that we were impacted, but also showing that we can all make the greatest changes if we have the right tools. Therefore, we want to give the right tools to all of the youth out there, all of those who want to implement a project, regardless of what that project may be, having a positive impact in the framework of Sustainable Development Goals, but also social innovation. Okay. Thank you very much for everything that you've shared. You've spoken about lots of different points. You've spoken about hindrances and new equality. And we're going to come back to some of the notions that you mentioned over the course of this roundtable. Thank you very much. Now let me move back to Thibault l'Espagnol. Thibault l'Espagnol, excuse me, says the moderator, because earlier you said even within the government there is a working group that has been implemented that is going to start working on the subject or the notion of youth commitment. And I wanted to know from your point of view from the government, because you are here representing the French government, why do you think that youth are taking this decision to commit, and what are the different positive aspects of youth commitment? I think that the sociologist sitting next to me is probably a lot more qualified to answer this question than I am. I think that what is clear, however, is that there are several different interests, not only just for the Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs, but also for youth commitment and the government. We know that we can't go it alone. We know that public policy isn't sufficient. Therefore, everyone needs to work together, all of the different citizens, but especially the young citizens out there, to act and react. We also work a lot outside of France in countries where there is a maybe 50 or 60% of the population is under 25 years old, and we know that youth, or the future is in the hands of the youth. The idea here is to understand how we can be agile enough to support the different initiatives that are cropping up, be this internationally or in France. As you know, when you're a state, there are lots of standards. When there are subsidies, we need to ensure that the subsidies go to an entity and not a person. We also need to know that the entity has been around for at least 3 years so that we can look at financial status. So these are different limitations that we come across. How do we deal with this when we're trying to support informal movements that can also come about, for example, during the Arab Spring or other uprisings that have occurred in Africa? How can we better support these informal networks? We don't know how they're going to evolve, whether they're going to become political bodies, if we could be accused of foul play. Therefore, what are the different alternatives for us between supporting individual commitment and collective commitment? If we think about individual commitment, we have volunteer schemes, we've got civil service. This can be done abroad. We have a different youth coming to France. We've also got international solidarity. Here there is not an age limit. We're looking at missions that are a lot longer, from 1 to 6 years old. You can work for a charity, an association, organization, putting your skills to good use. We also look at reciprocity. We have a legal basis to bring youth in from abroad working with French organizations within the country. Therefore, we're trying to make the most of the different tools out there so that we can support and also be the least standardized as possible, because from this point, maybe we do have standards that we need to respect. We also know that during the COVID pandemic, there were lots of different work streams, lots of different projects were not able to be implemented. How can we keep this flame burning? This is why we created this theme around international solidarity. We have subsidies available for youth who either want to work on video conferences or they want to prepare international action whilst waiting for the borders to open. There were a lot of projects that were submitted. This is something that went very well, and we also see that some of the projects have outlived the pandemic. Why? Because international projects and the incubation phase was important, and how can we maintain links whilst working remotely? These are the different ways that we've tried to adapt to types of commitment. Thank you very much, Thibaut de l'Espagnol. Now I'll give the floor back to Valérie Becquet, so that maybe you can talk about why you think that youth decide to commit. It's a very vague or vast question. In a nutshell, if we look at the different studies, regardless of the modality, regardless of the type of commitment, the initiatives, the consultation, regardless of the form that this takes, social movement or civic service, civil service, international solidarity, volunteer schemes, and other informal aspects. If we think about the reasons for commitment, they often resonate with personal experience or a reaction with regard to experience of others. It's a very subjective dimension. If we think about what makes sense, what gives meaning, why am I reacting to this? I went through this and I don't want other people to go through the same thing as I'm going through or have been through. And there is also a more objective point of view, and this goes for international solidarity as well. I want to work on international solidarity and I want to acquire different skill sets. Here, from an objective point of view, this is an objectivized commitment because I want to acquire expertise or competencies. These two dimensions are very present in the different types of commitment, with variations, balance between the two that is also going to be very variable. what are the different criteria of variability. We also have the social profile of youth, which is different, and also their journey, what they've been through in life. For example, I'm going to bounce off what you said, Ikma. Lots of different students come to study in France. You're not a foreign student. You are not from the metropole, so you are from an overseas department. You are not a foreigner. You are French. However, you've come to continental France, and in order to try and really ease into university life, you try to join an association or a group. Therefore, you know why you're doing it. You have a reason for this. And then they realize that there are other elements that come into play. There are balances between the different reasons, but there are always multiple reasons, I would think, for commitment. And another point, just to get the creative juices flowing, is it's not because you don't have a political or politicized attitude that you're not committed. The political dimension here, and I'm talking about different causes that have been identified or political parties, they can come along the way. You don't need to have a politicized relationship with the world. This is something that is part of a process. Therefore, I think that commitment, this is something that I mentioned earlier. Does this make sense to me? And does this have an impact on the way I envisage the world and also my impact on the world? Thank you very much, Valérie Becquet, for your explanation. I'm going to come back now to Lorraine Bastide. Why do you think that young people, or even people in general, decide to commit? Contrary to the others, I'm not an expert in the matter. I am not going to claim to be an expert either. I don't know why youth commit. However, I do have intuition, and we've spoken about this a lot. I think that rendering this subject legitimate is important. When I look at all of the different messages that I receive, often there is a hindrance to commitment, and this is I don't have the right, I'm not well equipped, my voice will not be heard, I'm not legitimate, I'm not credible, I will be discriminated against because of my social background, because I'm a person with disabilities, because of my gender. I am not legitimate, I don't feel legitimate to commit. And I also think that it's a shame that if you were to read my books or my podcast, this is also a form of commitment because you're gleaning information about the feminist movement. If we think about different, I've got lots of different women. We've got women who are from underprivileged backgrounds. But the majority of my listeners are actually cut from the same cloth. I hope that at the government and in the other forums we're fighting against that because it's a real barrier that I think is very important. And also to come back to what I am an expert in, I think representation is extremely important, and the role of the media and the culture is also important in this as well. For a young woman coming from an British background who hasn't gone to Sciences Po or one of the big universities in France, for her to also be able to feel that she can be politicized or have her voice heard, she needs to see people that look like her, be this in the assembly, the National Assembly, be this on TV, be this in films, in media, and this is why I think journalists have a very important role to play, so that people see people that are like-minded, and the time given, the speaking time given to expert women. We were talking about musicians, doctors, sociologists. It's 13%. 13%. So when we only have 13% of experts that are taking the floor on TV being women, how can other women say, oh, I'll be the one on that TV set later on? And I think that as a journalist, I also have a role to play in this. I want to try and inspire the young generations and say, yes, look, I'm legitimate, but you can be legitimate. You could be in my shoes. Because the question of legitimacy is something that we are going to be speaking about over the course of our session today. And just to come back to the why do you decide to commit? I am young, I am committed, and there wasn't really that eureka moment for me to take the decision to commit. I just had the need, the innate need to, and I'm not saying that it was a want, it was a need. I needed to help people and I wanted to be an actor of change for my generation. I wanted to change things. That's why I took the decision to commit. And now I'm going to turn to the audience. Is there anyone out there who wishes to take the floor? Anyone wants to talk about their story, why you took this decision to commit, and why you think that youth should also follow the example, follow suit, and commit as well? You can just raise your hand if you wish to take the floor. It's always hard to be the first person, but I know that there are lots of you out there who have things to share. Axel? And we also have a roving mic for the audience. It's just for the young lady here. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning. I have been working with Plan International. That's how I know Juliette. I am also committed in the environmental cause, and this has been the case since I was 7 years old. I started very early, and this came from a real need to help, as you mentioned. But for me, there was also a lot of anxiety because I was very, very scared very quickly about global warming and the future of the planet. Therefore, on a personal note, this came from a sense of injustice because I know that us in Europe, we are impacted by climate change, and when I saw what was going on in other countries, it was very difficult to farm because there were heavy rains. I really felt that there was injustice out there, and that pushed me to be involved in the defense of the environmental cause. And I also realized that we could align this, so the social aspects, but also the climate aspects, they are interlinked, and that's why I wanted to be part of Plan International when I was a student, to try and have an impact. And it is possible to take the decision to have a job that makes sense so that there is progress. Thank you very much. And is there anyone else out there who wishes to take the floor? I think we've got 2 hands raised over here.
Il a levé la main.
I think he was the first one to raise his hand, and then we'll give the mic to this person. Thank you. My name is William, and I work on Engagé and Déterminé, on the integration of the youth in the international solidarity sector. So we talk about activism, but there's also the political sphere. And here I'm mainly addressing you, Mr. L'Espagnol. We're talking about organizations and the commitment of the youth in this organizational sphere. But on the international level, we feel that young people need to partake in different organizations and different initiatives, especially when it comes to contributing to the SDGs. And Antonio Guterres talked about the youth involvement. So there is the notion of political commitment, and I feel like young people are not represented in the political sphere. People are saying that they want to listen to young people, we want them to be involved, but again, we only listen to young people, we don't involve them. And I see this with the organization that I work with. The youth is represented as a way to question the way that we've been working in the past, because people are scared of the youth in a way, because they're scared of having their modus operandi being challenged. And we do recognize that people can challenge our actions, but they're not involved. And I wonder what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and how the political sphere, and I know that there is a strategy for the youth. The French Development Agency also wants to involve the youth. But how can we make sure that the youth is involved and is actually a stakeholder and has a say in the changes that we need to see for the world? Thank you very much. That's a beautiful transition. We'll address this right after the last question. Maybe we had one last person who wanted to take the floor. My name is Anissa Apostoli, co-founder of Institut du Genre Géopolitique. So I'm a young person. I'm also an activist. And I had two questions, but the person right before me asked one of the ones that I wanted to ask. But I realized, just like you did, Laurent Bastide, that in when we're volunteering, when we have volunteers, when we have readers of our think tank and research center that analyzes international relations through the prism of the gender, and we realized that out of 300 people who are involved in our geopolitical center, there are people who have the same background as me, so mainly people who have the same social background, who've studied in the same schools, mainly in international relations, etc. So here's my question to the panel, and maybe also for the people online following the conference. How can we diversify? And how can we make volunteering and research from this center more accessible? And maybe if you've thought about it for your podcast, it would be a good idea to address this in your podcast. Thank you. Maybe very quickly, we'll give the top floor to the different members of the round table. Well, you can maybe take this question. I don't really know how to proceed. I don't have a set answer for that question, but I know that there are a lot of initiatives that were a source of inspiration for me. There are easy things, such as giving the mic, handing over the mic to the youth. This is what I tried to do with my podcast, because sometimes you have you have influence, you have a social positioning, maybe also you have a voice on social media to say that, well, today I'm not going to take the floor, I'm going to give the floor to someone else, someone who's probably less visible than me, who has a different status. Pass the mic, as they say in the US. And I think that this is something that we can do. We can really proceed in different ways. And as I was listening to you and to your question, I was thinking of something that I watched on YouTube. Marie Perrin, she's a YouTube influencer, and she created a series called Dans ma place, where she talks to 4 young women who live in the suburbs of Paris, and underprivileged suburbs, and she taught them how to become a director, and they were able to create their own documentary in their own context, using not only her material but also and her equipment, but also her time, her energy, and her knowledge. And at the end of the day, they were able to create this 2-hour documentary with not Marie's voice, but the voice of women who are not as visible, who don't have as many diplomas as she does or as we do. So yes, we do need to be active, and maybe sometimes go behind the scenes and pass the mic to other people. And I do think also it's necessary to go on site. Sometimes we feel like social networks are allowing us to reach out to different people, to the whole world, but it's actually just a bubble, and because of the algorithms, people will only see people who from the same background as you will see your publications, but you should really go to different schools, different regions of France, rural areas, underprivileged areas. I think that this can have an impact, and every time I did it, it's not that you're able to convert 30 people, but at least one. And that one person will probably create something, will probably create an organization or a movement or initiate something. And this is something that can be done one by one person at a time. But I took a look at your initiative and it looks great. Thank you. Thank you. Unless we have other questions, we might close this Q&A session. I do have a question. Maybe I can answer the question that was asked by the gentleman. I think now's the time. You can go ahead. Well, I actually answered both questions. First, I think we shouldn't forget if you want to commit, the first thing you can do is vote. You need to vote, and especially with such tight results, we have sometimes 10,000 votes difference between 2 different candidates. So even if you feel like you're not involved enough or you're not legitimate, voting is a way to act. Now, in a way, but you're right. Sometimes we feel like people are saying, well, we need to listen to the youth, we need to give them a role, etc., etc., but at the same time, nothing happens. I do think that listening to the youth is a first step, and Jean-Baptiste talked about the Youth 20. This is something that we did in 2019 when France was president of the G7. we created the Youth 7 at the time to create a group of young people. So each country had identified young people that wanted to get involved, to create a network of young people from the different 7 countries to talk and address the leaders of the world. But then what happens? That is the question. And it's not easy. Now, this question will probably be more for Valérie on local youth activism, because there's sometimes you can have budget on at local level for youth commitment. Now, it's not easy because there's also this prescriptive side of things. But again, it's not easy. We're actually currently discussing with colleagues from Germany and the Netherlands, and we're trying to create a permanent young people council to allow them to submit ideas at the local level. So this is a good idea, and then it's up to the different local skills to see how they can involve their input. But it's not only about listening to the youth. We need to really involve them more and make sure that we create this co-construction initiative. And as we said, at the international level, we do hear that it's a lot of privileged young people who are more visible. But we have the JAMO initiative, so young people with less opportunities, including Vie Village Vacances, coupled with a suburban policy. But it is true that it's much more costly to support and to accompany young people who don't have privileges, who don't have the codes, who don't have time, and to help them, to support them be more involved in the international solidarity initiatives. It takes more time and it requires more money, but it's up to organizations to do it. But in the first assessments that we have been able to do, the impact is huge. I was part of the Ambassadeur Solidaire a few years ago, which was an initiative where we would detect young people who never thought they could ever do volunteering, and we realized that it changed their lives. It was not just an additional line on a CV, as it can be for other students that are already committed and that can help them get hired by an organization or an international institution. For these people, it's something that is going to change their lives, and they're going to have other opportunities thanks to this commitment, because they will have more knowledge, more commitment, and more self-confidence. And we need these people. We need organizations in the field who can attract these people, who can attract these young people, to raise awareness and make sure that they can get involved in this commitment path. Valérie? Yes, well, the question you were asking is an old question that we've heard and that we've tried to answer many times. I'm sorry, it might sound a bit depressing, but the fact that local, international, European, international bodies include the youth is not new. We've had this. It's been a few years now. There are more and more bodies, more and more institutions that involve the youth. Usually young people who have a specific profile, so it does exclude other types of young people. But to me, the people that manage to partake in these initiatives do contribute. But now, what do we do outside of the youth presence is still a question that hasn't been solved at many levels, on many levels rather, especially in France. In France, where we strive for participative democracy, but in our institutions we're still struggling to implement the principles behind participative or participatory democracy. But it's interesting because in France, of course, you're right, you can vote, but it's either the vote or you protest. But we know that these processes are very long, and it's long regardless of the ministry to involve the youth. To involve people, the civil society and the youth, it takes even longer. Now, I'm not saying that we should give up, but it shouldn't come as a surprise that this question is asked times and times again. And it's true that sometimes giving the floor to people can come with frustration because there are sometimes our political sphere is reluctant, and especially in France. And when you compare our experience in France and in other European countries, you might wonder, well, how come in Nordic countries it seems easier? Well, that's probably because they don't have the same we don't have the same traditions of including citizens in our political processes. Therefore, in order to lobby for citizen contribution, it needs to be done in line with other lobbying activities, with organizations, etc. Again, we need to reiterate that it's not enough to just be present and to make our voices heard. It needs to go beyond that. We need to have little actions at every level. And again, it's really slow. These institutions are very slow. It takes a long time to move and to change these processes. But there are a lot of political policies and local policies that are actually influenced by the voices of the youth. But it's still very subtle. Therefore, we need to take the seat around the table because there are not many of them, and we need to make our voices heard. I'd like to answer your question. And if you want to inform more people, we're often confronted with the archetype of the perfect young, committed person. We're looking for that perfect profile. But as a committed young person, if we want to work on inclusivity, we need to work and to be aware of the privileges that we have. This is the first step in the right direction. We need to work on our privilege and maybe talk to people that are not privileged and think outside of the box, look for people who are sometimes marginalized. And this is probably the main challenge for us, especially when we're used to our processes and our modus operandi. We need to challenge this. We need to think outside of the box and try to find new challenges, new people, new profiles, in order to give more impact to the actions that we put into place and diversify these actions. Again, we said that we have a diversity of profiles in the youth. We have different people, and we cannot create this world for them without them. Thank you very much. We will probably have another Q&A session at the end of the next session, but I would like to talk about the hindrances. We were talking about the different obstacles to representation. And the fact that in our society, especially for women, we don't have enough representation, especially when it comes to experts or in governing bodies. So maybe ICMA could tell us a little bit more about the obstacles to representativity. What are they? Well, the lack of means and resources. And this actually brings me back to what Mr. L'Espagnol said earlier on some restricting criteria that we can find when it comes to looking for subsidies. For instance, where organizations need to have been created for more than X number of years, and need to be able to show that you can manage funds and that you can implement different actions. And sometimes it's very restrictive for organizations such as mine that was created in 2020. And yet, when we look in the governing body of the organization, the members of the organization have a lot of experience. And I think it showcases the fact that we are capable of a lot. But in a way, there's this natural selection because, again, there are a lot of requirements if we're looking for funds, and you need to be very creative in order to try and take on the challenges that we want to take on, even with very little means and resources at the beginning. So these obstacles can be overcome thanks to creativity, but again, it is true that we have this major lack of resources and means. Valérie Becquet, because I know that you work in this geopolitical research center, you probably have access to different funds, but you probably also are confronted with different obstacles. Well, beyond the prescriptive aspects and the legal and procedure related obstacles, the notion of you talked about inclusivity, and I don't actually know what it means. Of course, I'm kidding, but the word gender, does it make sense for everyone? Sometimes some organizations have expertise, but they use their own jargon. And in a way, it's very opaque and hard to understand for other people. Of course, I'm talking because I'm a teacher, but I think that it's important to make sure that the way that we talk and the language that we use is understandable by everyone. And the level of education that you have, according to reports, the higher the diploma, the higher the level of commitment. So your baccalaureate in France is an obstacle to activism. This is something that we've known for years. It really reduces the level of commitment. So this is another obstacle to activism and commitment to education. The other aspect that we need to take into account is the social success standards. When we look at young people's background, people who are committed, if we compare to other countries, getting a diploma is priority over social commitment. So young people who are not top of the class are going to have trouble feeling like they can afford to give time to other activities or organizations, while the others are going to be supported by their parents. Maybe they'll have a private teacher if they're having difficulties in such or such field. But if you have, so depending on your background, whether you have a vision for your future or not, your commitment is going to sometimes be seen as detrimental to your future, or at least to your studies. And this is something that we've seen with the service civique or other services that have this type of role. So I'd just like to insist on these two things. So skills, social skills, expertise, knowledge is an obstacle, or an obstacle rather. And the fact that people do not necessarily commit because we have standards for social success that are not always the same and not always available for everyone. Thank you very much. Could we talk about gender-based obstacles? You were talking about representativity and the fact that sometimes women don't feel legitimate. I know that you have carried out different interviews in your podcast. Are there other obstacles that your guests have talked about? Well, I'd like to add maybe a note of a pessimistic note, but I think that the reason why people don't commit is that people feel like it's useless. This is something that I hear in feminist groups, in environmentally friendly groups. I feel like people protest, they launch petitions, they write editorials, they write thesis, PhD papers. We give out brochures, but people don't hear us, don't listen to us, don't care about what we say. And I'm one of the people, as Mr. L'Espagnol said, I am one of the people who are really sad when we see the abstention levels at all the different elections, and at the same time I understand why, because we feel that it's useless. We have this deep feeling of uselessness, and this fight against systemic racism, every time we denounce systemic racism in police stations, in hospitals, not only people don't listen to us, but at the same time, people are seen as, are diabolical, we're diabolized because we're seen as anti-Republican. And the fact that the public institutions and the media don't necessarily react and don't follow up on these denunciations, on these actions, leads to the fact that young people think, well, what's the point? What's the use of all this? So I'm sorry, this was a bit pessimistic, but I think it does play a role in this. To be a little bit more optimistic, can you help us find solutions to overcome these challenges and obstacles? Well, I think, going back to what was said earlier, namely what Valérie said, and what we've all been saying actually since the beginning, as long as people consider that the right young person speaks a certain way, votes, is not too loud, is not too challenging, is not too anti this, pro that, it's not going to work. I think we should be more open to different profiles, different types of commitment, and I think we should listen to all the voices that can be heard in order to denounce inequalities and injustice. I do think that committed people, activists, should not be seen as a risk, the risk of losing something. We are still in a country where the education body can support young people and push people to commit, but at the same time we tell people, well, there's a risk, because if you miss this or if you fail this exam, it might be a problem for them. So there's this dichotomy where teachers on a daily basis will tell their students, well, I support you, but in a way this may be detrimental to your studies and your future. And when we analyze people's background and careers, we see the role of the first of people's study and whether they commit or not. And this is a long-term journey. If commitment is seen as a risk, why would young people commit? And beyond that, we need to think about the fact that it can create different triggers, and it can also create small gestures and daily actions that can make a change. And also, you were talking about the media. I was shocked. I was really shocked by the way that the media treated Greta Thunberg in France, and the way that politicians talked about her. I think it was the perfect example to show that we are really willing to discredit the youth commitment, to attack a young woman, to disqualify someone's position. And I do believe that the media have a responsibility to play and a role to play. Some journalists were positive about her, others tried to disqualify her actions, her words, and it was really detrimental to youth activism. And going back to the media, the journalists should think about their role. There's this notion of ethics. when we see young people who commit, we should talk about it in a different way. I've been working in this field for 20 years, and as long as people and journalists ask me, "Oh, do you think that this movement is the same as May 68?" I will consider that the media is not treating this properly. You're right, and the fact that we only talk about Greta Thunberg as if she was the only one to fight against climate change, the only young person to fight against climate change. And it is true that showing how harassed she was and how criticized she was in the media is a major hinder for young activism. And what we see on social media is problematic as well. So I think it's our role as well to protect them. Thank you very much. We have been talking about the obstacles to the youth commitment. But I would like to talk about a notion, a concept that was touched upon several times during this session, which is legitimacy. The fact that some people don't feel legitimate enough to commit. So I'd like to ask you, do you think that people need to be legitimate to commit as a young person? Do you think that someone's commitment need to be justified to be legitimate? Well, in my organization, when it comes to legitimacy, we believe that we cannot ask for legitimacy. We simply need to claim it regardless of how you feel. As we say in English, fake it till you make it. So you need to be bold sometimes and just simply do what you need to do without asking yourself too many questions. Because earlier I was talking about privileges for the people who feel that they're comfortable in different situations, different contexts. This is not a question that they ask themselves. Am I legitimate or not? No, they'll just do it. So we need to have this shift of mindset. And as for how we support as an organization people's commitment, we work on people's mindset and mental health, because sometimes we're confronted with people who we are talking to people who've had terrible experiences. So we try to work also on that, because if we want the youth to commit, we need to make sure that they have this self-confidence, and we know that we need to share our personal experiences. Peer learning is essential. This is something that we do, and we also try to listen to people, being heard and being listened to. And also hearing success stories, as we were saying earlier, is important, and it strengthens people's feeling of legitimacy to act as young people. I'd like to add to what was said. We need to make sure that people feel that they're safe, and this is something that we will talk about during another session. But this is also what I like about the movement that I work for. I think this is really important, especially when working with the youth. And Laurent Bastien, even if you don't work with the youth, I know that this is something that you probably hear a lot in feminist movements. You probably have a lot of people who wonder, well, do I have the right, do I have the legitimacy to commit to different movements, even if I don't necessarily fit in the right description? What do you think about the concept of legitimacy? Well, you're right. The question that you're talking about is a hot topic. We hear this question a lot in feminist movements, especially in what we call intersectional feminist movements. We look at sexist discrimination and other discriminations, including racist discriminations, etc. And what matters most is to give the floor to people who are more concerned, and this is central, and it's complex as well. We need to have a nuanced answer, because I do believe that you can be a feminist, and I hope, I want to see many feminist men. I think that you can be a man and be feminist and be legitimate, and I think that you can not be victim of racism and still fight against racism. It's really important. When you are not a victim of a discrimination, when we were talking about being aware of your privileges, being aware of the fact that you are not a victim of racism is something that should influence you and make you want to go to anti-discrimination protests or actions. And at the same time, being aware of the fact that we have privileges is something that I know can make you feel that you don't want to take the floor for someone who is a victim of discrimination. And it's true that when we see in the media a minister who has a lot of diplomas and that talks about these issues, when they're white, they have a lot of diplomas, and they say things and on behalf of women who have been saying the same things over and over again, but weren't heard, and they're in behind the scenes and they don't have the floor is problematic. But I do, at the same time, I do think that these people can amplify victims' voices. So it's a balance that you need to find. It's not an easy position. I understand. And you talked about not speaking on behalf of people. It's really important. We need to be able to support the youth to make sure that they know exactly what they're talking about, to make sure that they're well equipped. But it is paramount that we don't talk on behalf of others, and it's really important. Now, I'll give the floor to Valérie Becquet. You're working with the youth at university level. Is this something that you hear about, this notion of legitimacy?
Yeah, it's something that they often talk about, especially with my students. And I have a master's program, and so they're 3 years into their cycle, and they're looking at their legitimacy, but also how they can uphold their values and their right to say things, to have their voice heard within society. Therefore, they're not coming from privileged backgrounds. A lot of them work alongside their studies in order to be able to finance their studies. There are lots of different questions, for example, when they're giving in homework and when they think about the responsibilities. And if we think about this ourselves, this has a very strong impact on their future, which means that there are other teachers who don't really take this question on board. Therefore, I, in my classes, often speak about this. I often have to shake them up. Why? Because I know full well that if we don't do this now, it's not going to be too late, but it will be harder afterwards. Therefore, this legitimacy is something that's very important. Legitimacy, where there are sticking points, is because you've got your own legitimacy that you claim for yourself, that you proclaim to be your own. It's the fact that you have the right to say something, the right to have your voice heard, that then comes into tension or friction a little bit with legitimacy that is given to us. And we have the media that reacts to this. We know that it is a power struggle. Some people will see it through and power through. Other people will give up. And this power struggle for women, for youth who are committing, for those who want to go one step further, who don't throw in the towel, is important. I'm not saying that the others do throw in the towel, but maybe they're not as well equipped, maybe they're not strong enough to see this through. And just to come back onto this, I think it's something that you need to work on, because sometimes youth feel that they are illegitimate. The idea of being a citizen of the world, we're all concerned by this and by these subjects. We all have something to say. And we can say these things without speaking on behalf of others. And I have a now question to the audience. What do you think about this? What do you think about legitimacy? In your own commitment, have you found times where you felt illegitimate, or are there other people who have made you feel like you're illegitimate? Yes, we've got a request here for the floor. Have we got a roving mic? Good afternoon, my name is Diane. I'm part of the National Coordination for the Collective Nous Toutes. This is a group against sexual violence. And I think that the question of legitimacy is one that is really complicated and important, because we are not just looking at youth, but we have a lot of youth, especially youth women, uh, in schools, in secondary schools, and sixth form colleges, but also we work on social media. Obviously, we know that there are lots of youth who use social media, and it can be quite hard to feel that you're legitimate, especially as a young woman. Why? Because women don't tend to be heard, regardless of their age, but especially when they're young. There's not a lot of TV time, media time given to women. And we're really trying to look at all types of commitment. There is no wrong type of commitment. All type of commitment is legitimate. And we want, even if it's about sharing a post on a social media or coming to a demonstration or organize an event, there are lots of different levels. It's so important to insist on, regardless of the type of commitment, your commitment is important and legitimate. You can read up on things, you can work on your own ideas, and this is already a step in the right direction for commitment. There are lots of different shapes and sizes. I want to bounce off what Lorraine mentioned earlier. We're not heard, and when we're not heard, it's very difficult for us to feel legitimate, because we feel like people aren't listening to us. We are a big movement, a big collective, but even this, despite the size of our movement, I feel that the government, the media, are not listening to us, they're ignoring us. And we're saying exactly the same thing as a lot of people that aren't more legitimate to us, but we feel that they're more legitimate because for example, the High Council on Equality came out with a report recently saying that you need to respect the different sessions on sexuality, but we had a report that was also issued prior to the one coming out from the government, but nobody listened to it. Therefore, it's important for different fora to take on, and I would say more official fora to take this on, but it would also be a good idea for people to listen to us, because we're all singing from the same song sheet. You need to listen to them. And the only way that we can make ourselves visible, and we put lots of things, we've got lots of posters, but for us, we're going to organize something on the 19th of November. It will be the first way to make ourselves visible, and we need to listen to each other. Thank you very much. Thank you. The 19th of November, I'll pencil it into my diary. And there was someone here. Thank you very much for legitimacy. It's a question that is quite open. I was going to actually ask Ms. Becker what she thought about it. Whenever there is a youth who's talking about self-representation in political chambers, and we know that even it's very important, you need to go and vote. And the idea is to go back to this more passive or active space, whatever you like to call it, for self-representation. But just to bounce off what was said by Lorraine and the person who has their own media, this is an open question. Do you think it's important? Do you think that we should be looking at diversifying media or public? Because you said other people are the most concerned, so people who can really have the voice out of those with their own media, and we also need to have these media out there, and we need to talk about experience and personal experience. I remember that when we spoke about police racism and violence, there was a call to assemble before the administrative tribunal in Clichy, and I went, and I thought that there were only going to be 100 of us, but there were thousands of youth that were there to demonstrate against police violence and racism. Same thing, we were asking how we could diversify the public that is very white, educated, and I said, okay, do we need to include other movements, for example, feminist movements? Because by including them, we are taking them away from their own cause. So I'm not sure that if we should maybe ally ourselves, but also have each media having its own mobilization rather than having a ceasefire whenever we have an issue. So rather than cut everyone off and have everyone pulled together, we should maybe look at our own associations and our own medias. Yes, thank you very much. Would you like to respond? I think that what Fatima said is very legitimate because these are questions that we've had over the course of the past few years. We haven't yet come to a conclusion. If we think about what's happening in the feminist movement, there are lots of different waves, and there will be minorities, be we talking about racial minorities, lesbian or black women, and so on and so forth. We find that often that their claims are completely squashed under the common denominator, which is just a question of gender. It is a question that has got a lot of nuances and a lot of discussions, and I completely agree with what has been said. Thank you. And for Thibault Espagnol, would you like to jump in? Yes, I'm talking as a functionary, so someone who brushes shoulders with members of parliament. The feeling that you're not being listened to, or we're smiling, we're not along, but then we go back to our daily business. There are lots of different MPs. We have lots of municipal MPs who are listening to your claims and the claims of the youth, or by others who think that they know what youth want. But for public action now, obviously it's something that takes time. Whenever there is a law, you need time for it to go through. It's never something that's overnight. We also have a need for consensus. But when there is a need for consensus, sometimes we need to work hard on the joystick, but we are looking to have a real impact, and we know that young people want to have an impact on public policy development. This shouldn't be something that stops you from speaking out, because we are hoping that you speak out, be this in the different councils or the fora, looking at youth, but in the streets, in the media. There are lots of the different channels that you can use. You are having an impact. It isn't an immediate impact. It isn't always black and white. There are other functions that we need to look at as well for different commitments and so on and so forth. There are different types of commitments. There are people that are very sincere against the right for to abortion, for example, this because of Sharia law. And therefore, we need to be able to filter through this. It's not a question of legitimacy. If we think about the different presidential candidates, we never think whether they're legitimate or not. They decided that they were legitimate. They decided that they were going to put themselves forward to be president of a country. And therefore, it's not a question for me that's linked to legitimacy. It is not because you are committed that you are right, be this in your style or substance, but it shouldn't be something that dissuades you from speaking out. Legitimacy isn't physical. It's not because you click on A that you'll have B straight away. You even have different functionaries, different civil servants. We know that things that come out of the parliament don't just come out overnight. We have democracy, we've got the different lobby movements, we've got different commitments, we've got different citizens' engagement as well. But this means at the end we do have a result that is and can be frustrating for some of the parties involved. But the youth voice is important. It's not a question of black and white, though. Thank you very much. I don't know if we have enough time to take one last question or one last comment. We have... His hand was up before mine. Yes, thank you very much. It's not really a question. Tom Gaillard, I'm Vice President of Engagé and Déterminé. I just wanted to talk about legitimacy. I would like to bounce off the comment made about commitment. The issue of legitimacy. As a young person, I think that there are lots of us that have often felt illegitimate, but also not competent to deal with these different issues that we're confronted with. Obviously, competence and knowledge isn't something that you can acquire overnight, and you can be very competent but have no knowledge. However, I think that it's important that this doesn't prevent us from becoming legitimate. and I am continuing in my endeavours to do so. Mr. Espagnol spoke about a program for ambassadors for commitment and solidarity. I know a lot of ambassadors for citizen commitment. And on this point, I would like to say that yes, it's a great program. It is an excellent program that has been put forward by France Volontaire and the National Union for Local Missions. Why? Because for 3 consecutive years, the pilot project was undertaken each year with 50 or so youth across all of the French territory, and they were able to go abroad, and regardless of their age, their knowledge, their diplomas, their degrees, and so on and so forth, it was just the will that was there. Where there was will, there was a way. We speak about international solidarity, but actually it is a very all-encompassing notion. It goes above and beyond just the idea of international solidarity, because I am here sitting today in this room, but I haven't been to these big cities that where we can find economic or political powers. I haven't really had access to those spaces, but this is what is where you're in the thick of it. The program was able to set an impetus which I didn't really have access to prior to my 18th birthday. And this is why I say I was born in Paris in 1998, but also in Dakar in 2017 as a man. And this in flesh and blood. Therefore, we have said this, you need to just get stuck in. We've said this time and time again. Why? Because it's on the job, it's that you learn. And if I've now become the vice president of Engagé et Déterminé, it's because I've been able to look at the question of education for citizenship, for international solidarity. But to begin with, I actually took a gap before continuing with my studies, and I don't want to be discriminative, but little by little, I saw that international solidarity and the heart of this came from participation rather than professionalization. I had questions that were very similar to those asked by William, so I won't repeat them. And it is true that when you think about the optic of participation and youth, straight away we feel that we're not being listened to. You explain, I don't just want to criticize. You've spoken about how the ins and outs of political function, public function, and therefore that needs to be taken into consideration. But I do wish to finish by saying that we really need to be able to act on a national level, but also within our different youth movements, because there is a lag, a huge lag, between what we, on a general point of view, want to do and what we represent for the present and the future, and also what has been promised to us and what has been destined to us. And collectively, and maybe in an urgent fashion, we need to think about what the place for youth is. And I'm not talking about different individual youth, members of the youth community, but us as a whole. If we take time, for example, between our 18 and 25 years to come together, we could have an impact. What does this mean? This means that we're adults, we are able to vote, but we're still considered to be children. I think that we need to reflect on this. I think that we need to reflect on the position of youth in society so that we're able to take all of these different questions head on. Thank you very much. I know that we've gone over the time that was allocated to this session, but I know that there is a young activist that we're working with. Her name is Waabou and comes from Burkina Faso, who is an activist with an NGO rather, had a message that they wanted to share. They weren't unable to come physically with us, but they are following online. And there is a message here that I would like to share with you. Good afternoon. My name is Wahabou. I am a social activist, and I work for the respect of women. My actions are supported by Plan International, which is an NGO. I am the president of the advisory board of the youth advisory board rather for Plan International Burkina Faso. In our current days, activism through youth commitment has come to very high impacting actions that are also sustainable and more than necessary. The world is facing multiple crises. We've got the health crisis, we've got the climate crisis, and also food crisis, security crisis, and so on and so forth. The list is long, the challenges are enormous. Whether this concerns us directly or not, us as youth, we need to find solutions to these crises. We need to create a fair and egalitarian world, a fair world, a just world for the well-being of each and every one of us. This is our mission. Even if we are committed for different causes that don't concern us directly, this is legitimate. Why? Because we only have one world and we need to conserve it. Why? Because we are each and every one human beings and we need to nourish solidarity. We need to strive together for a better world. It was just what we were saying earlier as well with regards to the question of what is at stake. We can be a boy and a man and a feminist, and we can also commit in France, which is exactly what we're doing at Plan des Jeunes for youth questions.
Aussi au sein de l'ONG Plan International France par la mise en réseau.
And I think that everything should be done thanks to networks because the youth needs to meet. Abou came to France to meet Plan des Jeunes and to protest for the International Girls' Day. So we need to work hand in hand in order to become more legitimate. And maybe a word of conclusion. I know we are past the allocated time, but do we have 2 more minutes? Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Lauren. No problem. Thank you so much, everyone.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, everyone.
Dernière minute.
Just 1 more minute. Please wait. In 1 month time, this is our advertisement time. So in 1 month time, it will be the International Girls' Day. It will be the 10th anniversary of this event. So you have a QR code here, and we organizing an event. So you are more than welcome to get involved. We will talk about women and girl activists against gender-based discriminations and violence. So if you want to commit today, you are invited to partake in this event on October the 11th. We have stickers with figures on street harassment, online harassment, genital mutilations, and child marriage. You have a QR code you can subscribe, and you will have a reminder a few days before. And please come. We will have an event organized in Paris. Please collect these stickers, give them to your friends, stick them in your neighborhood, and please join us on October the 11th. And if you want more information about Le Plan des Jeunes, go on Twitter or Instagram. Plan des Jeunes, hashtag Plan des Jeunes, but you can also join us on the website Plan des Jeunes. Thank you very much.